The digital clock on the stainless steel wall of the laboratory read 2:14 a.m. The only sound in the cavernous, white-tiled room was the low, rhythmic hum of the centrifuge and the faint scratching of my pen against my leather-bound notebook. The air was thick, heavy with the rich, earthy scent of cold-pressed argan oil, layered with the sharp, clean notes of rosemary and the delicate, almost imperceptible sweetness of blue chamomile. My name is Kayla Lewis. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. I am 38 years old, and for the last 15 years, I have been the ghost haunting the halls of Lewis Crown Botanicals. I am the Chief Operating Officer and the Head of Research and Development. That is my official title, but the reality is far less glamorous. I am the backbone, the hands and the mind of a hair and skincare empire that has been sitting on the vanity tables of American women for nearly half a century. That night, my shoulders ached and my eyes were burning from staring at microscopic emulsions. But I couldn't stop. I was finalizing the formulation for our 50th anniversary Crown Heritage line. This wasn't just another product launch. This was my tribute to my grandmother, Evelyn, the woman who started this entire company in her tiny kitchen with nothing but a mortar, a pestle, and a profound understanding of what our hair and skin needed to thrive. I had spent 2 years perfecting this specific formula. It required a highly volatile extraction process that no one else in the company understood, let alone cared to learn. But when I finally held the amber glass beaker up to the harsh fluorescent light, watching the golden liquid catch the reflection, I felt a rare surge of pure, unadulterated pride. I had done it. I had captured my grandmother's legacy in a bottle. Less than 10 hours later, I would watch someone else steal it. The press conference was held in the Grand Ballroom of the Four Seasons in downtown Atlanta. The contrast between my quiet, sterile lab and this room was blinding. The space was flooded with the flashing lights of cameras, the chatter of beauty influencers, and the aggressive pop of champagne corks. I stood in the back of the room, near the heavy velvet curtains, wearing a simple, tailored navy suit. I was, as always, part of the wallpaper. All the light, all the attention was focused on the center of the stage. Standing behind the acrylic podium was my older brother, Deshaun. At 41, Deshaun possessed the kind of effortless, magnetic charisma that made people want to hand him their money. He was handsome, impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit with a smile that belonged on a billboard. He was the nominal CEO of Lewis Crown Botanicals. He was the face. Beside him stood his wife of 5 years, Vanessa. At 35, Vanessa was a lifestyle influencer who treated the family business as her personal aesthetic prop. She was stunning, wrapped in a designer cream silk dress, her hair blown out to perfection, smiling warmly for the cameras. Sitting in the front row, beaming with a pride so bright it physically hurt me to look at, were my parents, Stanley and Patrice Lewis. My father, at 68, still carried the imposing aura of a patriarch who believed the world revolved around his surname. My mother, 65, sat with her posture rigid, her pearls gleaming, the picture of the perfect corporate matriarch. Ladies and gentlemen, Deshaun's voice boomed through the speakers, rich and persuasive. For 50 years, Lewis Crown Botanicals has been a staple in your homes. But today, we aren't just looking at our past, we are looking at our future. A future driven by innovation, by passion, and by the brilliant mind of our new creative director, my beautiful wife, Vanessa. The crowd applauded politely. I felt a cold knot begin to form in the pit of my stomach. Creative director? That title had never been discussed in any board meeting. Deshaun stepped back, allowing Vanessa to take the microphone. She leaned in, her voice breathy and rehearsed. "Thank you, Deshaun," she cooed, gazing out at the audience. "You know, when I looked at our upcoming 50th anniversary, I knew we needed something revolutionary. I spent sleepless nights researching, diving deep into botanical properties, trying to find the perfect blend that honored Evelyn's original vision while bringing it into the modern era. And I am so incredibly proud to introduce to you the formula I created, the Crown Heritage Collection. The breath left my lungs, the formula I created." She gestured gracefully to the display table where the amber bottles, the exact bottles I had filled at 2 o'clock that morning, sat under spotlights. "I sourced the blue chamomile myself," Vanessa continued, lying with such fluid ease it was terrifying. "It was a labor of love, a true passion project from my heart to your homes." I stood frozen by the velvet curtains. I had sourced that chamomile. I had spent 6 months negotiating the supply chain. I had spent 2 years in the lab, breathing in fumes, failing, restarting, and finally perfecting the emulsion. Vanessa didn't even know the chemical difference between an essential oil and a synthetic fragrance. Her only contribution to the company was complaining that the lab smelled too much like dirt. I looked at my parents in the front row. I expected to see shock on my father's face. I expected to see confusion on my mother's. Instead, I saw my father nodding in profound approval. I saw my mother wiping a delicate, proud tear from the corner of her eye. They knew. They had known exactly what this press conference was going to be, and they hadn't said a word to me. The betrayal didn't hit me like a sudden blow. It seeped into my bones, a slow, freezing poison. When the conference ended and the room dissolved into a networking cocktail hour, I bypassed the champagne and walked straight to the private executive holding room behind the stage. I pushed the door open. My parents were inside. My mother, Patrice, was adjusting her pearl necklace in the mirror. My father, Stanley, was pouring a glass of sparkling water. They looked up when I entered, their expressions immediately shifting from celebratory to defensive. They knew why I was there. "What was that?" I asked. My voice was eerily calm, though my hands were shaking so badly I had to bury them in my blazer pockets. My father sighed, a heavy, impatient sound. He set his glass down. "Kayla, please." "Not today. It's a celebration." "She claims she formulated the heritage line, Dad," I said, stepping further into the room. "She told a room full of press that she sourced the ingredients. She doesn't even have a key to the lab." My mother turned away from the mirror. She moved toward me with that terrifying, soft maternal grace she only used when she was about to deliver a psychological blow. She placed a cool, manicured hand on my arm. "Kayla, sweetheart, you need to look at the bigger picture," Patrice said, her tone dripping with weaponized patience. "You are brilliant. We all know that. But you are, well, you prefer the background. You're not comfortable on stage. Vanessa is an influencer. She has 2 million followers. When she says she created it, it sells a lifestyle. It's just marketing, darling." I pulled my arm away from her touch. "It's fraud, Mom. It's a lie. And it's my life's work." My father stepped in, his voice taking on the deep, authoritative rumble he used to end arguments. "It is the company's work, Kayla. You are an employee of Lewis Crown, and right now the company needs a modern face. Deshawn is the CEO. He needs a strong narrative to secure his position. You are his sister. You should be supporting him, not throwing a tantrum out of petty jealousy." Jealousy. The word hung in the air, toxic and suffocating. "Jealousy?" I repeated, staring at the man who had demanded perfection from me since I was a child. "I have run the operations of this company for 15 years. I handle the supply chain. I formulate the products. Deshawn plays golf with investors, and Vanessa posts pictures of her brunch. And you're telling me I'm jealous?" "Deshawn is a leader," my father snapped, his eyes darkening. "He understands image. He understands growth. You understand formulas. There is a difference. We are trying to build a legacy here, Kayla." "Whose legacy?" I asked quietly. "The family's," my mother interjected, her voice sharp now. The soft maternal act was dropped. "And to protect the family, we all have to play our parts. Deshawn needs the confidence to lead. If that means his wife takes a little credit to boost their public profile, then that is a sacrifice you make for the family. You are a Lewis. Act like one and stop making this about your ego." "Stop making this about your ego." I looked at the two of them. I saw the unyielding patriarchal pride in my father's eyes, the deeply ingrained belief that a son, no matter how incompetent, was the rightful king. And I saw the insidious complicity in my mother's gaze, a woman who had spent her whole life shrinking herself for her husband and now expected her daughter to do the same for her brother. I didn't argue anymore. I realized in that stifling room that logic had no power here. They weren't blind to Deshawn's incompetence. They were protecting it. "I understand," I said softly. My voice was devoid of any emotion. My mother visibly relaxed, a triumphant smile touching her lips. "Good girl. Now, go splash some water on your face and come join the party. Vanessa wants to take a family photo for her page." "I have work to do in the lab," I replied, turning on my heel. I walked out before they could say another word. I didn't go back to the party. I drove straight back to the corporate office. The building was completely empty. Everyone still at the hotel celebrating the genius of Vanessa Lewis. The silence of the corporate floor was a relief. I needed to clear my head. My mother's words had been echoing in my mind. For the past 2 months, they had been pressuring me to have knowledge transfer sessions with Vanessa. They told me they were planning a massive West Coast expansion, and Vanessa needed to understand the basics of R&D and supply chain to act as the liaison for the new facility. I had spent hours writing detailed manuals, simplifying complex operational protocols into color-coded binders so Vanessa could comprehend them. I had given her lists of our primary vendors, our cost margins, and our emergency manufacturing protocols. I walked into Vanessa's new, absurdly large corner office, an office twice the size of mine, decorated in pale pinks and brushed gold. I needed to grab the vendor ledger I had lent her yesterday. Her desk was a cluttered mess of PR packages, unread fashion magazines, and half-empty iced coffees. I began shifting a few glossy magazines aside, looking for my ledger. As I moved a stack of papers, a heavy, cream-colored folder caught my eye. The tab was labeled in my father's immaculate handwriting, Project Crown Transition, strictly confidential. My hand hesitated. I wasn't a snooper. I respected boundaries. But the sheer, blatant cruelty of the morning had shattered my usual professional decorum. I flipped the folder open. Inside was a 50-page document drafted by an outside consulting firm, commissioned by Deshawn and approved by my father. I began to read, and as I did, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The cold stone in my stomach turned to ice. There was no West Coast expansion. There never had been. The document was a highly detailed, step-by-step phased exit strategy. My exit strategy. Phase 1. Knowledge extraction. That was the heading for the past 2 months. The manuals I had written, the vendor lists I had compiled, the training sessions I had endured, it was all designed to systematically drain every ounce of institutional knowledge out of my brain and put it on paper for Deshawn and Vanessa. Phase 2. Public realignment. That was today. The press conference, stripping me of my final, most valuable asset, my credibility as the formulator of the 50th anniversary line, and transferring that public credit to Vanessa. Phase 3. The severance. I turned to page 42. There, highlighted in pale yellow, was the timeline. It was scheduled for the night of the 50th anniversary gala, exactly 3 weeks from today. The document explicitly outlined that keeping me on staff was a threat to the unified leadership narrative of Deshawn and Vanessa. I was too knowledgeable, too foundational, and therefore an obstacle to their total control. The plan was for my father to publicly announce his retirement at the gala, hand full executive control to Deshawn, and simultaneously announce my voluntary departure from the company to pursue other passions. Attached to the back of the file was a drafted severance agreement. They were offering me 6 months of my base salary. 6 months. For 15 years of my life. For building the formulas that generated millions. And tucked beneath that was a draconian non-disclosure agreement, legally binding me to never speak about my role in the company or claim ownership of any formulas. I stood in the silence of Vanessa's perfumed office, the heavy cream paper trembling slightly in my hands. If they had just fired me, it would have been painful. If they had just asked me to step down, it would have been a betrayal. But this was a calculated, cold-blooded assassination of my life's work. My father, my mother, my own brother, they had sat around a mahogany table with consultants, drinking coffee, and meticulously plotted how to harvest my brain, steal my achievements, and discard me like a used piece of laboratory equipment. All so the golden boy could wear a crown he didn't earn and his wife could play business mogul for her internet followers. I didn't cry. The time for tears, the years of crying in my car after being overlooked, the years of desperately trying to earn my parents' validation was officially over. A profound, terrifying stillness washed over me. It was the calm of absolute clarity. They thought I was just the quiet girl in the lab. They thought because I didn't demand the spotlight, I was weak. They thought they could take the empire my grandmother built and simply lock me out of the castle. I carefully placed the Project Crown transition folder back on the desk exactly as I had found it. I smoothed the magazines over it. I made sure not a single thing looked disturbed. I walked out of Vanessa's office, down the long corridor, and back into my laboratory. I looked at the beakers, the scales, the raw ingredients that I knew better than I knew my own family. They wanted a transition. They wanted to take ownership of Lewis Crown Botanicals. Fine, I thought, a cold smile finally touching my lips in the empty room. I'll let them have it. But they were about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you steal the crown from the only person who actually knows how to keep the kingdom from burning to the ground. The 3 weeks leading up to the Lewis Crown Botanicals 50th Anniversary Gala were an exercise in supreme psychological endurance. If my parents and my brother had expected me to unravel after the press conference, they were deeply disappointed. I didn't stage a protest. I didn't burst into my father's mahogany-paneled office demanding what I was owed. I didn't even offer a passive-aggressive comment at the Sunday family dinners, which I continued to attend with the precise, mechanical regularity of a ticking clock. Instead, I became exactly what they wanted me to be, the compliant background workhorse. I sat through 6 more knowledge transfer sessions with Vanessa. I watched her sip iced matcha lattes while aggressively highlighting meaningless paragraphs in the operational binders I had provided. I watched her completely ignore the complex supply chain matrices that actually kept the company afloat, focusing instead on the aesthetic design of the vendor packaging. I just feel like our primary botanical supplier's logo is too industrial, Vanessa mused one afternoon, tapping her manicured nail against a spreadsheet that detailed our raw material costs. Do you think we could ask them to rebrand, or maybe we just switch to someone with a more organic vibe? You can certainly bring that up in your next vendor negotiation, Vanessa, I replied, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of sarcasm. I didn't tell her that the industrial supplier she was referring to was the only farm in North America capable of producing the volume of blue chamomile we required at a grade pure enough to prevent our formulas from separating. I didn't tell her that switching suppliers without a 2-year transitional testing period would result in thousands of bottles turning rancid on store shelves. I just smiled and poured her more matcha. I was giving them the rope. They were the ones eagerly tying the noose. In the evenings, when the corporate offices were dark and empty, I packed. I didn't take company property. I took my personal intellectual capital. The heavy leather notebooks filled with my grandmother Evelyn's original undigitized scribbles. The private logs of my own chemical trials from the past decade, the ones that proved the exact threshold at which our preservatives failed, the ones that detailed the microscopic adjustments I made seasonally to adjust for crop variations. I wiped my personal server partitions clean. I left the company exactly what it legally owned, the final basic recipe sheets, the how, but I took the why. And in the beauty industry, the why is the only thing that separates a luxury staple from a chemical hazard. When the night of the 50th anniversary gala arrived, the air in Atlanta was thick with a late spring humidity. The event was held at the St. Regis. Lewis Crown Botanicals had rented the entire Astor Ballroom. It was a spectacle of excessive, unbridled wealth, a physical manifestation of my father's ego. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over tables draped in heavy ivory silk. Centerpieces of white orchids and rare botanicals designed to mimic our product ingredients towered over the silver cutlery. I arrived precisely on time, stepping out of my town car in a tailored, floor-length emerald green gown. It was severe, structured, with a high neckline and long sleeves. It wasn't a dress designed to attract the flash of the paparazzi waiting by the red carpet, who were currently screaming Deshawn and Vanessa's names. It was armor. I slipped into the ballroom through a side entrance, bypassing the step and repeat banner. I took my assigned seat at table 1, the immediate family table. My mother, Patrice, was already seated, holding court with the mayor's wife and a few key investors. She wore a custom Carolina Herrera gown in a soft lavender, her neck weighed down by a diamond collar. When she saw me, her eyes did a quick, assessing sweep of my dress. "Kayla," she said, her smile tight. "Emerald, a bold choice. A bit austere for a celebration, don't you think?" "It's comfortable, Mother," I replied calmly, taking my seat. "Well, you always did prioritize utility," she murmured, turning her attention back to the mayor's wife. "Deshawn and Vanessa are still on the carpet. The press just absolutely will not let them go. They are the new royal couple of Atlanta business, I swear." I took a slow sip of my ice water. The absolute certainty in her voice, the complete lack of guilt regarding what they were about to do to me tonight, solidified the ice in my veins. Dinner was a blur of pan-seared sea bass, vintage Bordeaux, and the dull roar of 500 industry executives, distributors, and influencers networking. I ate methodically. I conversed politely with the vice president of our largest retail distributor, who sat to my left answering his questions about our future production capabilities with vague, reassuring corporate jargon. Then, the lights in the ballroom dimmed. A single spotlight hit the main stage. The low hum of conversation faded into an expectant silence. My father, Stanley Lewis, walked out from behind the velvet curtain. He looked magnificent. At 68, he still had a full head of silver hair, a broad-shouldered physique, and a commanding presence that demanded absolute attention. He stepped up to the microphone, adjusting his tuxedo jacket. 50 years! His deep baritone echoed through the massive room. Half a century ago, my mother, Evelyn Lewis, stood in a tiny kitchen with a dream and a profound respect for the earth. She built a foundation, and for the last 40 years, I have had the profound honor of taking that foundation and building an empire. Applause rippled through the room. My father bowed his head, soaking it in like rain on parched soil. But an empire, he continued, his voice lowering to a dramatic, intimate pitch, must look to the future. It must evolve. The market changes. The world changes. And a true leader knows when it is time to pass the torch to a new generation. A generation with fresh eyes, bold vision, and the dynamic energy required to take Lewis Crown Botanicals global. He extended his hand toward the side of the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my greatest pride to officially announce my retirement as CEO and to introduce the new leadership of Lewis Crown Botanicals. The new CEO, my son, Deshaun Lewis, and our new creative director, Vanessa Lewis. The ballroom erupted. The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that shook the crystal glasses on the tables. Deshaun and Vanessa walked onto the stage, holding hands, bathed in the blinding white spotlight. Deshaun waved, looking humbled and powerful. Vanessa blew a kiss to the crowd, wiping a perfectly timed, delicate tear from her cheek. My father embraced Deshaun, clapping him hard on the back before kissing Vanessa's cheek. He stepped back to the microphone. Under Deshaun's brilliant financial guidance and Vanessa's groundbreaking work on the new Crown Heritage line, which, as you know, is already breaking pre-order records, I know this company is destined for greatness. My mother, sitting beside me, squeezed my arm. It was a warning grip. Stay still. Play your part. Now, my father said, the celebratory tone shifting slightly, becoming somewhat more solemn, more patronizing. A transition like this means restructuring. It means new directions, and it means acknowledging the quiet pillars that have held us up along the way. He looked directly at Table 1. He looked directly at me. My daughter, Kayla, has been our chief operating officer and head of our labs for 15 years. She has been meticulous. She has been diligent. Meticulous. Diligent. The words were chosen with surgical precision. They were the words you use to describe a reliable filing cabinet, not an innovator, not a creator. But, my father continued, his voice projecting a fake paternal warmth that made my skin crawl. Building an empire takes a toll, and Kayla and I have had many long, heartfelt conversations recently. A flat-out lie. We hadn't spoken more than 10 words to each other since the press conference 3 weeks ago. We both agreed, Stanley projected to the silent room, that after 15 years of tireless, behind-the-scenes work, it is time for Kayla to step away from the grueling demands of corporate life. It is time for her to focus on herself, to find her own happiness outside the walls of a laboratory. A low murmur swept through the room. Industry insiders knew what this meant. This wasn't a retirement. This was an ousting. The golden boy was taking the throne, and the workhorse sister was being put out to pasture. Kayla, my dear, my father said, gesturing to me, please, come up here. The spotlight swung violently, blinding me for a second, illuminating me in my emerald dress. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. 500 pairs of eyes were fixed on me, waiting to see the humiliation, the shock, the breakdown. I felt my mother's nails dig slightly into my forearm. Smile, she hissed under her breath. I stood up. I didn't adjust my dress. I didn't look at my feet. I kept my spine perfectly straight, my chin parallel to the floor, and I walked the 60 feet to the stage with the slow, measured cadence of a judge entering a courtroom. I climbed the stairs. Deshaun stood to the side, looking slightly nervous, his perfect smile tight. Vanessa looked at the floor. My father stood by the podium, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope and a heavy, obelisk-shaped glass award. I stopped in front of him. To our meticulous worker, my father said into the microphone, handing me the glass obelisk. It was heavy, cold, and utterly meaningless. A tombstone for 15 years of my life. Then he pressed the cream envelope into my other hand. The severance package. A token of our immense gratitude. We love you, Kayla." He leaned in to hug me. I allowed it, standing stiffly as he patted my back for the cameras. He pulled away and gestured to the microphone. "Say a few words, sweetheart." This was phase 3. This was the moment I was supposed to gracefully capitulate. I was supposed to thank them, express my exhaustion, and validate their lie to the entire industry. I was supposed to publicly hand over the keys to my own kingdom. I stepped up to the acrylic podium. I set the glass obelisk down with a sharp, resonant clack. I placed the cream envelope next to it. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw the faces of our distributors, our marketing teams, our investors. I saw my mother sitting in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on me with a terrifying, breathless intensity. I didn't reach into my purse for a tissue. I didn't let my voice waver. "Thank you, Stanley," I said into the microphone. I didn't call him Dad. The slight breach in protocol sent a microscopic ripple of tension through the room. 15 years, I continued, my voice calm, clear, and ringing with absolute authority. It is a long time to spend inside the engine of a machine. You learn every gear, every piston, every stress fracture. You learn exactly what keeps the machine running and exactly what it takes to break it. Deshaun shifted uncomfortably behind me. I didn't turn around. My brother, Deshaun, and his wife, Vanessa, are now the captains of this ship. They have a vision for the future of Lewis Crown Botanicals, a vision of mass expansion, of new marketing frontiers, of a different kind of product. I let the word different hang in the air for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, just long enough for the intelligent people in the room to hear the warning beneath it. I have spent my life honoring the physical reality of my grandmother Evelyn's legacy, I said, my gaze sweeping the room. The science, the soil, the truth of the ingredients. But Stanley is right. The burden of maintaining that truth is heavy. It requires an uncompromising dedication to reality rather than just the image of it. I turned my head just slightly to look at Deshaun and Vanessa. And tonight, I am officially handing that heavy burden to you. I turned back to the audience. I looked down at my mother in the front row. Her knuckles were white. Her perfect aristocratic mask was slipping, revealing a flicker of genuine, unadulterated fear. She was an expert in reading social dynamics, and she knew, with terrifying certainty, that I wasn't surrendering. I was declaring war. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. And then, for the first time that entire evening, I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It wasn't a polite, camera-ready smile. It was a cold, dead, terrifying baring of teeth. It was a smile that promised absolute ruin. My mother visibly shivered. She actually shrank back into her chair. "Good luck, Deshaun," I said softly into the microphone. "You are going to need it." I didn't say thank you. I didn't say goodbye. I picked up the cream envelope because I fully intended to have my lawyer dissect the severance offer for any legal loopholes. But I left the heavy glass obelisk sitting alone on the acrylic podium. I turned my back on my father, my brother, and my sister-in-law. I walked down the stage stairs. The silence in the Astor Ballroom was deafening. Nobody clapped. Nobody moved. The atmosphere had shifted from a celebratory gala to the breathless, heavy quiet of a room that had just watched a bomb be armed. I walked down the center aisle, past the tables of staring executives, past my mother's terrified face. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the ballroom and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the hotel. I walked out the front doors into the humid Atlanta night. The valet brought my car around. I got in, locked the doors, and placed the severance envelope on the passenger seat. They had their company. They had their titles. They had the applause. But as I drove away from the Ritz-Carlton, watching the glowing skyline of the city in my rearview mirror, I felt a strange, soaring sense of liberation. I had spent 15 years holding up a crumbling ceiling to protect the people who lived inside the house. Tonight, I had finally stepped outside. Now, all I had to do was wait for gravity to do its job. The silence of the Blue Ridge Mountains was a vastly different kind of quiet than the sterile hush of my old laboratory. 4 months had passed since the night of the gala. I hadn't returned to my sleek, minimalist condo in downtown Atlanta. Instead, I had driven 2 hours north, deep into the lush, heavily wooded hills of North Georgia, and signed a 1-year lease on a secluded A-frame cabin built of cedar and stone. I changed my phone number the morning after the gala. I didn't leave a forwarding address with the corporate office. If human resources needed to send my finalized severance paperwork, which my lawyer had aggressively renegotiated to ensure I surrendered exactly 0 of my personal intellectual property. They could send it to my legal counsel. For the first time in 15 years, I woke up without the crushing weight of a multi-million-dollar supply chain pressing on my chest. I spent my mornings drinking black coffee on a wooden deck that overlooked a valley of mist-covered pines. I spent my afternoons tending to a small, wild garden of herbs I had planted in the rocky soil. But mostly, I spent my time at a heavy oak dining table, surrounded by the physical remnants of the only person in my family who had ever truly seen me. My grandmother, Evelyn. When Evelyn passed away 10 years ago, she didn't leave her journals to my father, her only son. She left them to me. There were dozens of them, bound in worn, cracking brown leather, the pages yellowed and filled with her elegant, looping cursive. They weren't just recipe books. They were the diaries of a brilliant, marginalized Black woman navigating the world of chemistry and commerce in the 1970s. She documented the pH levels of rainwater, the optimal extraction temperatures for raw shea, and her uncompromising philosophy that what you put on your body should be as honest as what you put in it. I read them like a religious text. It was here, in the quiet of the mountains, tracing her ink with my fingertips, that the rage finally began to settle into something sharp, cool, and incredibly focused. I had cut off my family, but I was not entirely blind to the world. You cannot dedicate your entire adult life to an industry and simply turn off the data feed. I kept a burner laptop on the kitchen counter, and every Friday evening, I would pour a glass of red wine and log on to check the pulse of Lewis Crown Botanicals. At first, the data reflected exactly what my parents had engineered, a massive, flashy triumph. The launch of the Crown Heritage Collection was a masterclass in modern digital marketing. Vanessa had spared no expense. My screen was flooded with high-definition videos of her hosting lavish, pastel-colored brunch events for mega influencers in Los Angeles and Miami. Deshawn was featured in glossy business magazines leaning against the brick wall of our historic Atlanta factory, wearing a custom suit hailed as the dynamic new visionary of minority-owned beauty. Sales skyrocketed in the first 4 weeks. Pre-orders broke every record the company had ever set. I watched the quarterly revenue projections leak online, showing a massive spike. If you only looked at the surface, which was the only place my father, Deshawn, and Vanessa ever looked, they were winning. They had successfully amputated the boring, difficult workhorse and replaced her with a glittering, highly profitable show pony. But I wasn't looking at the surface. I was a chief operating officer. I looked at the architecture, and the architecture was fundamentally flawed. The first cracks didn't appear in the financial sheets. They appeared in the product itself. It started quietly around week 8. A few obscure beauty forums began to murmur. Then, the Reddit threads appeared. By week 12, it was a full-blown digital crisis. I sat at my oak table, the glow of the screen illuminating the dark cabin, and read the reviews. I've used Lewis Crown for 10 years, bought the new Heritage line. It smells like cheap floor cleaner and synthetic vanilla. What happened? Did they change the formula? The cream separated in the jar after 2 weeks. It's literally water and oily chunks. Heartbroken. This used to be the only thing that moisturized my roots. Use the new deep conditioner and my hair feels like brittle straw. Threw a $45 jar in the trash. I didn't feel joy as I read the devastating comments from Black women who had trusted our brand for decades. I felt a deep, sickening grief for my grandmother's name, but analytically, I knew exactly what had happened. I had left them the basic recipe, but a recipe is not a manufacturing protocol. When you scale up a botanical formula from a 100-gallon vat to a 10,000-gallon industrial mixer, the thermal dynamics change completely. If you don't adjust the cooling rate by a fraction of a degree per minute, the emulsion will destabilize. It won't happen immediately. It will happen roughly 8 weeks later, right as the product sits on a customer's bathroom counter. But it wasn't just the emulsion. Deshawn and Vanessa had actively tampered with the ingredients. A loyal former colleague, a senior procurement manager named David, who had quietly despised Deshawn for years, had risked his job to call me on a secure line 3 weeks prior. "Kayla, it's a bloodbath down here," David had whispered, the sound of the busy corporate floor muffled in the background. Vanessa threw a fit about the cost of the Moroccan blue chamomile you sourced, said it was eating into the marketing budget. Deshawn authorized a supplier switch. They replaced it with a synthetic fragrance oil and padded the volume with dimethicone. Silicones. Cheap, suffocating silicones. They had taken a 50-year-old healing formula and turned it into a cheap cosmetic illusion, all to increase the profit margin from 60% to 85%, so they could fund Vanessa's influencer trips to Dubai. And the retailers? I had asked quietly. Panicking, David replied. Target just reported a 40% return rate on the Heritage line. Sephora is threatening to pull our end cap displays if we don't issue a recall for the separated batches. But Deshaun refuses to recall. He says it's just a coordinated smear campaign by jealous competitors and told the PR team to double down on social media ads. The arrogance was astronomical, but completely on brand. Deshaun was a man who believed reality could be altered if you just smiled brightly enough at a camera, but you cannot gaslight chemistry. By the end of the 4th month, the financial hemorrhage became impossible to hide, even with creative accounting. Revenue from the initial launch spike had evaporated, replaced by the staggering cost of wholesale returns. Loyal customers weren't just abandoning the new line. The breach of trust was poisoning our legacy products too. Sales across the entire Louis Crown catalog dropped by 30%. That Friday night, as a summer thunderstorm rattled the windows of my cabin, I decided it was time to stop reading social media and start reading the legal filings. I opened a secure browser and accessed the Georgia Secretary of State's business database, followed by the county clerk's property records. If Deshaun was bleeding cash while simultaneously funding a lifestyle of private jets and custom G-Wagons, the money had to be coming from somewhere. I knew the company's liquid cash reserves when I left. They weren't enough to sustain this level of catastrophic mismanagement. I cross-referenced Louis Crown Botanical's corporate tax ID with recent Uniform Commercial Code UCC filings. Nothing unusual showed up at first, just standard equipment leases. Then, I pulled the property records for 402 West Mitchell Street. My heart skipped a beat, a cold, heavy thud in my chest. 402 West Mitchell Street was the address of the Louis Crown Historic Factory Building. It was a massive, beautiful red brick warehouse built in the 1920s. Evelyn had purchased it outright in 1985 with cash she had saved for 15 years. It was the physical heart of our empire. It was fully owned, free and clear, unencumbered by a single cent of debt for over 2 decades. It was the fortress that ensured no matter how bad a fiscal year was, the company always had a home. Staring back at me on the screen, dated just 6 weeks ago, was a newly registered commercial deed of trust. Deshaun hadn't just taken a line of credit. He had mortgaged the historic factory. He had leveraged the very bricks my grandmother had bought to secure a massive infusion of cash. I scrolled down to read the principal amount of the loan, $12 million. $12 million in short-term, high-interest corporate debt secured against a property that was the only tangible asset keeping the company from insolvency. I felt a wave of genuine nausea. My father, Stanley, had spent his entire tenure as CEO preaching about the sanctity of being debt-free. He had been terrified of banks. How had Deshaun convinced him to sign off on this? Or had Deshaun, armed with the new, absolute executive control my father had foolishly handed him at the gala, simply done it without telling him? I scrolled further down the digital document, my eyes scanning the dense legal text to find the name of the lien holder. I expected to see a major national bank, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, maybe a large regional credit union. Instead, I saw the name of a private equity firm, Sterling Horizon Partners, LLC. The name hit me like a physical blow. Sterling Horizon Partners wasn't a bank, it was a slaughterhouse. In the insular world of corporate finance, the name Vance Sterling was whispered with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. He was a corporate raider, a vulture capitalist of the highest order. His firm specialized in finding distressed, legacy family businesses with valuable assets but incompetent second-generation leadership. Sterling would offer them massive, predatory loans when traditional banks refused. The loans were designed with impossible repayment covenants. Vance Sterling didn't want the interest payments. He wanted the default. When the business inevitably failed to meet a payment, Sterling Horizon would instantly call the loan, seize the collateral, strip the company of its assets, fire the staff, and sell the intellectual property to massive conglomerates for a massive profit, leaving the founding family with nothing but dust. I leaned back in my wooden chair, the light from the laptop casting long, harsh shadows across my grandmother's journals. Deshaun was a fool. He had thought he was securing a $12 million war chest to fund his marketing fantasies and his wife's vanity projects. He had no idea he had just invited a great white shark into a wading pool. He had taken $12 million from Vance Sterling, and based on the plummeting sales data and the massive wave of retail returns, there was absolutely no way Lewis Crown Botanicals was generating enough liquid cash to cover the exorbitant monthly interest, let alone the principal. They were going to default. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. I looked at the date on the loan origination. Based on standard Sterling Horizon covenants I had studied in business school, the first quarterly financial review would be triggered at the 120-day mark. That was in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, Vance Sterling would look at Deshawn's catastrophic books, declare the company in technical default due to revenue drops, and trigger the acceleration clause. He would demand the $12 million back immediately. When Deshawn couldn't pay, Sterling would seize the Mitchell Street factory and the Lewis Crown brand. My brother had managed to destroy a 50-year-old, debt-free, multi-million-dollar empire in exactly 4 months. I closed the laptop. The screen went black, plunging the kitchen into darkness. I sat in the silence, listening to the rain beat against the cedar roof. I thought about my father, sitting in his country club, proudly telling his wealthy friends about his brilliant son, the CEO. I thought about my mother, aggressively defending Vanessa's lies, convinced that image was more important than substance. They had sacrificed me on the altar of their own archaic, patriarchal pride. They had chosen the illusion of a king over the reality of the woman who built the kingdom. And now their paper empire was about to burn to the ground. I reached out in the dark and rested my hand on the cracked leather cover of my grandmother's journal. I traced the embossed letters of her initials. E.L. Vance Sterling was a shark. He was ruthless, brilliant, and completely devoid of sentiment. He thought he was about to swallow Lewis Crown Botanicals whole. He thought Deshawn was the only obstacle in his way, a minor inconvenience to be swatted aside. But Vance Sterling, just like my father, my mother, and my brother, was operating under a massive, fatal misconception. They all believed that the Mitchell Street factory, the corporate bank accounts, and the glossy bottles on the Sephora shelves were the actual company. They believed that Deshawn Lewis held the keys to the empire. They were wrong. I stood up from the table, walked to the kitchen counter, and poured the rest of the red wine down the sink. I didn't need it to sleep tonight. My mind was clearer, sharper, and colder than it had been in my entire life. It was time to pack my bags. My 4 months of peace in the mountains were over. Atlanta was about to become a war zone, and the men fighting for control of my family's legacy had absolutely no idea that the ground they were standing on didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. I didn't drive south to Atlanta. I drove further south past the sprawling concrete arteries of the city down into the deep, sweltering heart of rural Georgia, where the soil turns a rich blood red and the air hangs heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. I drove for 4 hours until the highway narrowed into a 2-lane blacktop, and the blacktop dissolved into a private, unmarked gravel road. At the end of that road sat a pair of heavy, wrought iron gates. They were rusted at the hinges, unassuming, and completely devoid of any corporate signage. I pulled my SUV to a stop, rolled down the window, and punched a 6-digit code into the keypad hidden behind a sprawling Confederate jasmine vine. The gates groaned open, granting me access to Oak Haven, 500 acres of private, fiercely protected agricultural land. As I drove up the long dirt driveway, flanked by ancient weeping live oaks draped in Spanish moss, my chest finally uncoiled. The rows began to appear. Acres upon acres of low-lying, vibrant green shrubs, their leaves shimmering with a distinct, almost metallic silver undertone. This was the Carolina silver-leaf calendula. It wasn't a standard botanical. It was a genetic anomaly, a highly specific mutation that produced an oil with unparalleled anti-inflammatory and cellular regenerative properties. You couldn't buy it from a commercial supplier in Europe. You couldn't import it cheaply from Asia. It only grew here, in the highly specific, slightly acidic red clay microclimate of this exact valley in South Georgia. I parked my car near the old white-paneled farmhouse that served as the property's main office. Stepping out into the oppressive summer heat, I closed my eyes and breathed in the sharp, peppery, floral scent of the fields. This smell was the scent of my childhood, and it was the scent of the single greatest secret my grandmother had ever kept. 15 years ago, I was 23, freshly graduated with a master's degree in chemical engineering and spending every waking hour I could with Evelyn. She was 72 then, her body growing frail, but her mind remained as sharp as a diamond cutter. I remembered one specific afternoon in the humid glass greenhouse behind her home. We were repotting seedlings. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis but incredibly gentle, were stained black with soil. "Look at the roots, Kayla," she had instructed, her voice a low, gravelly rasp. She lifted a delicate seedling, exposing the complex, fragile web of white threads beneath the dirt. Everyone falls in love with the flower. The flower is pretty. It gets the attention. But the flower is temporary. If the root is shallow, the first strong wind will rip the whole plant out of the earth. We had been interrupted by the sound of a heavy door slamming open. Deshaun, 26 at the time, had sauntered into the greenhouse. He was wearing a designer linen suit smelling of expensive cologne and entitlement. He was supposed to be at the Mitchell Street factory learning the inventory logs. "Grandma, it's a sauna in here," he had complained, casually swatting a low-hanging fern out of his way. "Listen, I was talking to Dad. We need to redesign the labels on the deep conditioning mask. They look like they belong in a pharmacy. I have a buddy at an ad agency in New York who can rebrand the whole line, make it look luxury. We just need an authorization for a $50,000 retainer." Evelyn hadn't looked up from her soil. She had simply continued packing dirt around the base of her seedling. "The label isn't what heals a woman's scalp, Deshaun. The extract does. And until you can tell me the exact pressing temperature required to yield that extract without denaturing the proteins, you will not touch my packaging." Deshaun had scoffed, rolling his eyes in that familiar, exasperated way he reserved for women he deemed difficult. "Nobody cares about the pressing temperature, Grandma. They care about the aesthetic. Dad agrees with me. We need to focus on the image." He had turned and walked out, his leather loafers crunching carelessly over some spilled soil, leaving the greenhouse door wide open to the wind. I had knelt down to sweep up the dirt he had kicked over. I was furious, my face burning with the injustice of his arrogance. "Why does Dad listen to him?" I had muttered. "He doesn't know anything about the product." Evelyn had slowly wiped her hands on her canvas apron. She looked at the open door, her dark eyes clouded with a profound, quiet sorrow. "Your father," she said softly, "sees a prince. He looks at Deshaun and sees the continuation of his own ego. He sees a king to inherit his castle." She turned to look at me, her gaze pinning me to the floor. "But I see a boy playing with matches in a house made of dry wood." She reached out and placed a soil-stained hand over mine. "Stanley thinks the empire is the brick building on Mitchell Street. He thinks it's the bank accounts and the letterhead. He doesn't understand that a company is just paper. Paper can be rewritten. Paper can be burned." She squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You are the scientist, Kayla. You understand the earth. When the day comes, and it will come, that they try to hand your brother the crown, you let them. Let them have the paper. Because I am going to make sure that you, and only you, hold the roots." I didn't fully understand what she meant until 10 years later. 5 years ago, on the anniversary of her passing, I received a cryptic summons to the downtown Atlanta offices of Julian Caldwell. Julian Caldwell was an institution. He was an 80-year-old, ruthlessly sharp corporate attorney who had represented Evelyn since the 1970s. He did not work for Lewis Crown Botanicals. He did not work for my father. He worked exclusively for the Evelyn Lewis estate. I had sat in his dark, mahogany-paneled office, listening to the ticking of a grandfather clock as he slid a thick, leather-bound folio across his massive desk. "Your grandmother," Julian had said, peering at me over the rims of his reading glasses, "was the most legally paranoid and brilliantly forward-thinking client I have ever had the pleasure of representing." He opened the folio. Inside were deeds, patent filings, and a stack of corporate and corporation documents. "Before she passed, Evelyn established a blind trust," Julian explained, his voice dry and precise. "She knew that if she left her assets directly to the company, your father would eventually transfer control to your brother. She did not trust your brother's fiscal responsibility. Therefore, she separated the intellectual property from the operational entity." He tapped a manicured finger on the top document. "Lewis Crown Botanicals, the company your father runs, owns the factory, the mixing vats, the bottles, and the brand name, but they do not own the magic inside the bottles." I had stared at him, confused. "What do you mean? The company owns the formulas." "They own the recipes," Julian corrected smoothly. "A recipe that says, add 10 ounces of silver leaf calendula extract. but they do not own the silver leaf calendula. He slid a registered U.S. agricultural patent toward me. It bore my grandmother's name, detailing the exact genetic strain of the Carolina silver leaf calendula. Evelyn patented the strain, Julian said, and she quietly purchased Oak Haven Farm, the only 500 acres of land on Earth where the soil acidity allows this specific strain to produce its healing yield. She placed the farm, the agricultural patent, and the exclusive extraction rights into a holding company called Oak Haven Agricultural LLC. My breath had caught in my throat. I knew that name. Oak Haven Agricultural was the single largest line item on our raw materials ledger. Lewis Crown Botanicals paid them over $2 million a year for the raw extract that formed the base of 90% of our products. Who owns Oak Haven Agricultural? I had whispered. Julian had offered a rare, razor-thin smile. He slid the final document across the desk. It was an operating agreement. As of your 33rd birthday, per the conditions of the blind trust, the executor duties dissolved, Julian said. You are the sole member, 100% equity owner, and managing director of Oak Haven Agricultural LLC. You own the land, Kayla. You own the patent. Your family's company has been your tenant, buying their lifeblood from you for the last 5 years. They simply don't know it, because the LLC is managed through my firm to ensure your anonymity. I had sat in Julian's office, my world tilting on its axis. Evelyn hadn't just left me an inheritance. She had left me a loaded gun and hidden it right under my father's desk. And the contract between Oak Haven and Lewis Crown? I had asked, my analytical mind instantly snapping into gear. A standard commercial supply agreement, Julian replied. Renewed annually, with a very specific termination clause. Should Lewis Crown Botanicals ever default on a payment or attempt to alter the integrity of the raw material by mixing it with unauthorized synthetics, Oak Haven Agricultural reserves the right to immediately sever the supply chain without penalty. Now, standing in the sweltering heat of the Oak Haven fields 15 years after my grandmother's warning, I watched a tractor slowly making its way down a row of silver-green plants. The farm manager, a weathered man named Thomas who had worked the land since Evelyn's days, drove up in a dusty pickup truck and stepped out, wiping his brow with a bandana. Miss Kayla, he greeted me with a warm, respectful nod. Didn't expect you down here from the mountains so soon. We're about 3 weeks out from the main harvest. Hello, Thomas, I said, smiling genuinely. How are the yields looking? Best in 5 years, he said proudly. The soil is perfect. The extraction facility is prepped and ready. We've got enough raw yield to supply the Atlanta factory for the next 18 months. He paused, a slight frown creasing his sun-baked forehead. Though, I gotta ask, we haven't received the quarterly purchase order from corporate. Usually your brother's finance team sends it over by the 1st of the month. We're 3 weeks late, and he hesitated. And what, Thomas? And the last 2 invoice payments from Lewis Crown bounced, he said quietly. Julian Caldwell's office called me yesterday to confirm. We haven't been paid for the spring shipment. I looked out over the fields, feeling the hot wind rustle the silver leaves. Vanessa. During those agonizing knowledge transfer sessions before the gala, I had watched Vanessa highlighting the vendor ledgers with her pink marker. I had watched her eyes widen at the $2 million annual cost for Oak Haven Agricultural, and she hadn't just replaced the blue chamomile for her new heritage line. In her infinite, arrogant greed to free up cash for her marketing budget, she had looked at the largest expense on the ledger and axed it. She had canceled the Oak Haven orders, likely sourcing cheap, generic calendula from an overseas bulk supplier for pennies on the dollar, completely unaware that she was stripping the literal cure out of the company's entire legacy catalog. That was why the legacy products were failing. That was why the 40% return rate was destroying them. She had removed Evelyn's magic and replaced it with cheap synthetic grease. And by defaulting on the Oak Haven invoices, Deshawn and Vanessa had legally breached the supply contract. Don't worry about the corporate purchase order, Thomas, I said, my voice perfectly level. Lewis Crown Botanicals won't be buying our harvest this year. Thomas blinked, stunned. But, Miss Kayla, without this extract, their products are just scented lotion. The company will tank. The company is already tanking, Thomas, I replied. Keep harvesting, run the extractions, bottle the pure oil, and store it in the climate-controlled vaults. We are going to hold the inventory. I guarantee you the value of what is in those vaults is about to skyrocket. I thanked him and got back into my SUV. I didn't drive back to the mountains. I pointed my car north, back toward the sprawling, chaotic skyline of Atlanta. My brother had mortgaged the historic factory to a corporate raider for $12 million. He was bleeding cash, his products were toxic, and his retailers were abandoning him. And Vance Sterling, the vulture capitalist, was sitting in his glass tower, watching the clock tick down, waiting to seize the Lewis Crown brand and sell its famous formulas to the highest bidder. Vance Sterling thought he had my brother trapped in a corner, but Vance Sterling didn't know about Oakhaven. He didn't know that the formulas he was plotting to steal were legally useless without the patented extract that I exclusively owned. He thought he was buying a gold mine, but he was actually buying a map to a mine that I had already boarded up and locked. Evelyn was right. The building on Mitchell Street was just bricks. The company name was just paper. I picked up my cell phone from the center console and dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. It rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered. Law offices of Julian Caldwell. This is Kayla Lewis, I said, my eyes fixed on the highway ahead. Put Julian on the line. There was a brief pause, a click, and then the dry, familiar rasp of the old attorney. Kayla, I was wondering when you'd call. I assume you've seen the UCC filings regarding the Mitchell Street property? I saw them, I said, and Thomas just informed me about the bounced invoices. A fatal error on your brother's part, Julian noted, devoid of sympathy. Per the terms of your grandmother's operating agreement, Oakhaven Agricultural LLC is now legally emancipated from any exclusivity obligations to Lewis Crown Botanicals. You are a free agent, my dear, and your brother is currently manufacturing highly flammable garbage. I need you to draft a formal notice of termination of supply, Julian, I commanded, my tone shifting into the executive cadence I had honed over 15 years. Cite the breached payments. I want it sent by certified mail to Deshawn's desk, effective immediately. It shall be done, Julian said, a hint of dark amusement in his voice. And what about the impending default with Sterling Horizon Partners? I looked at the Atlanta skyline growing larger on the horizon. The storm clouds were gathering over the city, heavy and dark. Let Vance Sterling call the loan, I said coldly. Let him seize the factory. Let him drag my father and my brother into the boardroom and strip them of their paper crowns. You aren't going to intervene? Julian asked. I am, I replied, pressing my foot down on the accelerator, but not to save them. I'm going to intervene to make sure Vance Sterling knows exactly whose property he's trespassing on. Set up a meeting, Julian. I think it's time the ghost of Lewis Crown Botanicals introduced herself to the monster. I hung up the phone. The quiet girl in the lab was dead. The landlord had returned to collect her rent. The collapse of a 50-year-old empire doesn't happen with a sudden explosion. It happens like a sinkhole. The foundation erodes quietly, millimeter by millimeter, in the dark, until one day, the earth simply gives way and swallows everything whole. For Lewis Crown Botanicals, the earth gave way on a Tuesday in early September. I was sitting in Julian Caldwell's downtown office, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching the bloodbath unfold on the financial news networks. The volume was muted, but the chyron crawling across the bottom of the screen screamed the reality. Lewis Crown Botanicals faces massive consumer backlash over chemical burns. Retailers pull products. Vanessa's cheap synthetic substitutes hadn't just separated in the jars. The unregulated dimethicone and artificial fragrances, when exposed to the high heat of late summer shipping, had destabilized the preservative matrix. The product had effectively fermented. Women across the country were reporting severe scalp irritation, hair breakage, and chemical burns. A massive class action lawsuit was trending on Twitter. Sephora didn't just pull the end caps, they ordered a global quarantine of all Lewis Crown inventory and demanded an immediate multi-million-dollar refund. Target and Ulta followed suit within 48 hours. The $12 million lifeline Deshawn had borrowed from Vance Sterling was completely vaporized in the span of a week, swallowed by legal retainers, emergency PR firms, and the staggering logistics of a nationwide recall. And then, exactly as the loan covenants dictated, Vance Sterling struck. He didn't call, he didn't send an email. He sent a phalanx of corporate attorneys to the Mitchell Street factory with a notice of default and acceleration. Deshawn had 48 hours to produce the $12 million in liquid cash, plus the exorbitant penalty fees, or Sterling Horizon Partners would execute their right to seize the collateral, the factory, the brand, the patents, and the personal assets Deshawn had foolishly pledged to secure the loan. That was why, at 10 a.m. on a Thursday, I found myself walking into the subterranean parking garage of the Sterling Horizon Partners high-rise in Midtown Atlanta. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit. Julian Caldwell walked beside me, his leather briefcase clutched in his weathered hand, his expression an unreadable mask of legal lethality. "Vance Sterling has booked the 40th floor boardroom," Julian said quietly as we stepped into the glass elevator. "He intends to force a fire sale. He will offer to forgive the $12 million debt and keep your family out of personal bankruptcy in exchange for 100% equity in Lewis Crown Botanicals. He wants the brand name to sell to a conglomerate. He wants the illusion," I corrected, watching the floor numbers climb. "He wants the reputation my grandmother built, but he's about to find out he's buying an empty box." When the elevator doors opened, the atmosphere on the 40th floor was frigid. We walked past sleek, minimalist reception desks and into the main boardroom. The room was dominated by a massive slab of polished black marble that served as a table. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying, omnipotent view of the Atlanta skyline. We didn't enter immediately. Julian had requested an adjoining observation room, a standard feature in high-stakes negotiation suites separated by a pane of one-way acoustic glass. I wanted to see the architecture of their ruin before I dismantled it. Through the glass, the scene in the boardroom was a portrait of devastation. Vance Sterling sat at the head of the marble table. He was a lean, wolfish man in his late 50s wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my first car. He was scrolling through his phone, looking utterly bored. He was a predator waiting for his prey to bleed out. Sitting across from him were my father, my mother, Deshawn, and Vanessa. If I hadn't despised them, I might have felt pity. Vanessa was no longer the glowing, arrogant influencer from the gala. She was pale, her designer dress looking suddenly oversized, her eyes darting around the room in absolute terror. She was staring at a thick stack of legal documents in the center of the table, the acquisition agreement that would strip them of everything. Deshawn was sweating. The golden boy's perfect posture had collapsed. He sat with his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands, trembling visibly. He looked exactly like what he was, a middle-aged man who had finally run out of other people's brilliance to hide behind. But it was my father, Stanley, who captured my attention. Stanley Lewis, the proud, unyielding patriarch, looked as though he had aged 20 years in 4 months. His skin was an ashy gray. His hands, resting on the black marble, shook uncontrollably. I watched as my father slowly raised his head and looked at Deshawn. Even through the soundproof glass, I could read the absolute, devastating betrayal in his eyes. Julian tapped a button on the wall console, piping the audio from the boardroom into our observation suite. "It's the only way, Stanley," Vance Sterling was saying, his voice a smooth, indifferent drawl. "Sign the equity transfer. I forgive the $12 million. I assume the liability of the class action lawsuits, and I let you keep your private residences. You walk away with nothing, but you walk away free. If you don't sign, I seize the factory today, and I freeze your personal accounts by tomorrow morning." Deshawn let out a dry, choking sob. Dad, please, just sign it. We have to." My father didn't look at the papers. He turned slowly to my mother, Patrice, who was sitting rigidly beside him, her face a mask of horrified denial. $3 million, my father whispered, his voice cracking, echoing through the boardroom speakers into my suite. Deshawn flinched as if he had been struck. Vanessa squeezed her eyes shut. "What?" Vance Sterling asked, mildly annoyed by the familial melodrama interrupting his acquisition. $3 million, Stanley repeated, his voice rising, thick with a grief so profound it seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. He slammed his shaking fist onto the marble. "I went to my broker this morning, Vance. I was going to liquidate my entire retirement portfolio. My 401k, the private mutual funds, the emergency trusts. I was going to cash out 40 years of my blood and sweat to pay down this boy's debt and save my mother's company." My mother let out a small, terrified whimper. "Stanley, please." Stanley ignored her, his eyes blazing with a wild, broken fury. "But when I opened the accounts, they were empty. The balances were zero." He slowly turned his head to look at Patrice. 30 years, Patrice. 30 years of marriage, of trust. And the bank manager had to show me the wire transfers. Transfers dating back 5 years. Transfers you authorized with your dual signature power. The air in the boardroom went dead. Even Vance Sterling stopped scrolling on his phone, suddenly fascinated by the spectacular implosion of the Lewis family. In the observation room, I stood perfectly still. This was a dark, rotting secret I hadn't even found in my forensic accounting. "Stanley, I had to," Patrice sobbed, the tears finally ruining her perfect makeup. She reached for his arm, but he violently recoiled. He was drowning. He was in so much trouble. "Trouble!" Stanley roared, his voice bouncing off the glass walls. "He wasn't in trouble, Patrice. He was a degenerate. I saw the destination accounts, offshore casinos, high-end exotic car leases. $2 million sunk into a failed cryptocurrency scheme he bought into because some idiot on Instagram told him to. You stole my life savings. You stole our future to fund his delusions." "He is your son," Patrice shrieked, dropping her aristocratic facade entirely, her face contorting into ugly, desperate justification. "He is the heir. He needed to look the part. You put so much pressure on him to be the king, Stanley. What was I supposed to do? Let him fail? Let his friends see him fail? I protected his image." "You didn't protect him," Stanley bellowed, tears finally spilling down his ashy cheeks. "You enabled a parasite, and you let him convince me to push Kayla out, the only person in this godforsaken family who actually knew what she was doing." The mention of my name hung in the air like a ghost. Deshaun couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. "Stop it! Both of you, shut up!" he screamed, his voice cracking in absolute hysteria. "The money is gone. The company is gone. Stop talking about the past and just sign the damn paper so we don't go to prison." Vance Sterling sighed, tapping his gold pen against the marble. "As entertaining as this is, I have a tea time at 2:00. Sign the equity transfer, Stanley. You have no money. Your son is a fraud. Your wife is a thief. It's over." My father looked down at the contract that would surrender his mother's legacy to a vulture. His shoulders slumped, the fight completely drained out of him. He was a hollowed-out shell of a patriarch. He reached a trembling hand toward the gold pen Vance Sterling offered him. "Julian," I said softly in the observation room, "it's time." Julian nodded. He opened the connecting door. The heavy click of the latch echoed in the silent boardroom. My father's hand froze inches from the pen. 5 heads snapped toward the door. I walked into the room, the heels of my pumps clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Julian followed, closing the door softly behind us. I didn't look at my mother's tear-stained face. I didn't look at Deshaun's trembling hands or Vanessa's wide, terrified eyes. I looked directly at Vance Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and echoing with absolute authority. "I am Kayla Lewis, former Chief Operating Officer of Lewis Crown Botanicals. I apologize for the interruption, but before my father signs that document, I feel morally obligated to inform you that you are about to purchase stolen, defective merchandise." Vance Sterling narrowed his eyes, a predatory spark lighting up his gaze. He loved a complication, especially one wrapped in a tailored suit. "And how is that, Ms. Lewis? I am purchasing a corporate entity and its intellectual property." "You are purchasing a corporate entity," I agreed, walking slowly to the opposite end of the marble table, standing directly across from him. "But you are not purchasing its intellectual property, because Lewis Crown Botanicals does not own it." Deshaun let out a hysterical, breathless laugh. "What are you talking about, Kayla? Are you insane? We own the patents. We own the formulas. Dad gave me the company." "Dad gave you a building, Deshaun," I said, not even looking at him. I kept my eyes locked on Vance Sterling. "He gave you mixing vats and a fleet of delivery trucks, but he didn't give you the Carolina silver leaf calendula." Julian Caldwell stepped forward, unlatching his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of documents and slid them precisely across the black marble until they rested directly in front of Vance Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," Julian said, his gravelly voice dripping with legal condescension, "I represent the Evelyn Lewis estate, and specifically Oak Haven Agricultural LLC. As you will see in those filings, my client holds the exclusive agricultural patent for the genetic strain of the botanical extract that forms the active, stabilizing base for 94% of the Lewis Crown product catalog." Sterling picked up the documents. His eyes scanned the patent filings with frightening speed. He was a mathematician of human misery, and I could see his brain running the calculations. "Furthermore," Julian continued, "Oak Haven Agricultural LLC holds an exclusive licensing and supply agreement with Lewis Crown Botanicals. an agreement that your prospective acquisition, Mr. Deshaun Lewis, breached 45 days ago by defaulting on 2 consecutive invoices and attempting to substitute the patented extract with unauthorized, highly toxic synthetic silicones. I watched my father's face. He was staring at me as if I had just risen from the dead. "What does this mean?" Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling. I finally looked at her. I looked at the woman who had stood on a stage and claimed my life's work as her own. "It means, Vanessa," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register, "that the Crown Heritage line you so proudly formulated is a chemical biohazard. And it means that as of yesterday afternoon, Oak Haven Agricultural LLC has officially terminated its supply contract with Lewis Crown. The legal notice was delivered to Deshaun's desk at 9 a.m. I turned back to the vulture capitalist. "So, Mr. Sterling, you can force my father to sign that paper. You can take ownership of the Lewis Crown name, but you cannot legally manufacture a single one of its original successful products. You will own a brand that is currently facing a massive class action lawsuit for chemical burns, and you will possess absolutely none of the raw materials required to fix it. If you sign that paper, you aren't buying a beauty empire. You are buying a toxic waste dump and a $500 million liability." The boardroom was so silent you could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling vents. Vance Sterling looked from the patent documents to me. He evaluated my posture, the cold certainty in my eyes, and the presence of Julian Caldwell, a man whose legal reputation was bulletproof. Sterling didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He just smiled, a slow, terrifying, deeply amused smile. He recognized a fellow apex predator. "Well played, Ms. Lewis," Sterling murmured. "An invisible guillotine, beautifully executed." He picked up the gold pen he had offered my father, but instead of handing it back to Stanley, Sterling smoothly, deliberately capped it and slid it into his breast pocket. Then he picked up the thick acquisition agreement, the document that would have saved my parents from personal ruin. With a single, sharp motion, he tore the contract in half. My mother screamed, a short, piercing sound of absolute despair. Deshaun collapsed back into his chair, gasping for air as if he had been shot. "The acquisition is off," Vance Sterling announced, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. He looked down at my father with the cold indifference of an executioner. "The brand is worthless. The collateral is compromised." "Vance, please," my father begged, his voice shattered, reaching out a trembling hand. "We can negotiate. We can—" "There is no negotiation, Stanley," Sterling cut him off. "You have nothing I want. The $12 million note is in default. Since the brand is a liability, I will be executing my secondary rights. By 5 p.m. today, my firm will seize the Mitchell Street factory. By tomorrow morning, I will be placing liens on your primary residences, your vehicles, and any remaining liquid assets to satisfy the debt. You are bankrupt, Stanley. Utterly and completely." Sterling picked up his phone, gave me one last, assessing nod of respect, and walked out of the boardroom without looking back. The heavy glass door swung shut behind him, sealing my family inside their tomb. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and thick with the stench of total annihilation. My mother was rocking back and forth in her chair, sobbing hysterically, her hands covering her face. Deshaun was staring blankly at the torn pieces of the contract on the black marble, his mind completely broken by the reality of his own actions. Vanessa was hyperventilating, clutching her designer purse as if it could somehow shield her from the impending poverty, and my father. Stanley Lewis slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He didn't look at his wife, the woman who had stolen his future. He didn't look at his son, the boy who had burned his legacy. He looked at me. He walked slowly around the massive marble table until he stood just a few feet away from me. He looked at my severe, tailored suit. He looked at the uncompromising, icy calm in my eyes. He looked at the daughter he had treated like a servant, the daughter who had just revealed she held the keys to the entire kingdom in her pocket the whole time. "Kayla," my father whispered, his voice a broken, hollow rasp. "Oak Haven, the patent, Evelyn gave it to you?" "She did," I said. "And you—" "You just watched us," he said, tears finally pooling in his proud eyes. "You watched your brother take the loans. You watched him sink the company. You could have stopped this. You could have told us about the extract." "I could have," I agreed, my voice devoid of a single ounce of pity. "Just like you could have stopped Deshaun from stealing my work. Just like you could have stopped Mother from enabling his gambling. You built a house of lies, Stanley. I just refuse to be the foundation holding it up anymore. We are your family, he pleaded, the final desperate weapon of a man with nothing left. We are going to lose our home, Kayla. Your mother and I, we will have nothing. Please, you own the extract. You can restart the supply. You can build a new company. You can hire us. You can save us. I looked at the broken old man standing in front of me. I thought about the 15 years I spent in the shadows. I thought about the press conference. I thought about the severance envelope sitting on the acrylic podium. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to stand in the wreckage of his own arrogance. Then, I delivered the final fatal blow. Generosity, I said softly, echoing the words my grandmother had spoken to me in the greenhouse so many years ago, is giving a seed to a farmer. Giving gold to a fool who doesn't know its value is a sin. I adjusted the cuff of my blazer. You made your choice at the gala, Stanley. You chose your king. Long live the king. I turned my back on my father. I didn't look at my mother's sobbing form or my brother's catatonic stare. Julian Caldwell opened the boardroom door for me, and I walked out into the bright, sterile hallway of the Sterling Horizon offices. Behind me, the glass door clicked shut, trapping the echoes of their weeping inside the soundproof room. I walked toward the elevator. The air felt incredibly light. The ghost was finally free, and the kingdom of paper was burning exactly as it was meant to. The death of a dynasty does not end in a boardroom. It bleeds out into the weeks that follow, a slow, agonizing process of desperate people trying to catch water in a sieve. For Vanessa, the desperation manifested in a frantic, humiliating scramble to salvage whatever pennies she could from the wreckage of her creative director title. 2 days after Vance Sterling tore up the acquisition agreement and seized the Mitchell Street factory, the corporate bank accounts were frozen. The PR crisis firm Deshawn had hired dropped them due to non-payment. The influencer friends who had happily drank Vanessa's champagne at the gala suddenly stopped returning her texts, terrified of being associated with the chemical burn lawsuits currently trending across every social media platform. But Vanessa was nothing if not a survivor of the superficial world. She thought she still had one card left to play: the physical inventory. There were still 300 pallets of the original, pre-tampered Lewis Crown products sitting in a secondary, independently leased warehouse outside of Atlanta. It was millions of dollars in retail value. If she could just liquidate that stock to secondary wholesalers or discount distributors, she could secure enough liquid cash to hire a decent defense attorney for Deshawn and salvage her own personal bank accounts before the bankruptcy courts froze them. I knew this because she left a hysterical 3-minute voicemail on my burner phone on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I sat on the porch of my mountain cabin, listening to her voice crack and shrill through the speaker. "Kayla, you have to call them off," Vanessa shrieked into the phone, the sound of her hyperventilating sharp and clear. I just spent 4 hours on the phone with the VP of purchasing at our biggest wholesale distributor. I offered them the legacy inventory at a 70% discount. 70%. And they laughed at me. They said their legal department flagged a clause. A key person clause? What did you do, Kayla? What did you do to the contracts? I took a slow sip of my herbal tea, looking out over the mist rolling through the pines. I hadn't done anything illegal. I had simply done my job. 3 years ago, when I was renegotiating the master distribution agreements with our top-tier retail partners, the retailers had expressed concern about quality control, knowing my father was nearing retirement age. To secure their shelf space, I had voluntarily inserted a standard corporate safeguard, a key person clause. The clause explicitly stated that the wholesale purchase agreements were contingent upon my continued active oversight as the Chief of Research and Development and Quality Assurance. If I were ever removed from my position, the distributors retained the absolute unilateral right to cancel all pending purchase orders, reject all standing inventory, and sever the contract without any financial penalty or obligation to buy. When my father and Deshawn had consultants draft my exit strategy, they were so blinded by their own arrogance, so focused on getting rid of me, that they hadn't bothered to read the actual distribution contracts keeping the company alive. By firing me at the gala, they hadn't just removed their formulator. They had legally invalidated every single wholesale distribution contract the company held. The 300 pallets of inventory sitting in that warehouse weren't assets. They were dead stock. Radioactive material that no legitimate retailer would touch, legally barred from the market. Vanessa had absolutely nothing left to sell. I deleted the voicemail. 3 weeks later, I received a text message from my mother. It was the first direct communication from her since the boardroom. The bank is taking the house tomorrow. Please, Kayla, just come see us once before we have to leave. I didn't want to go. I had no desire to revel in their misery. My vengeance was not born of sadism. It was born of a profound, necessary boundary. But Evelyn had always taught me to finish what I started, to close the circle so the past could never leak into the future. The Lewis family mansion was a sprawling 10,000 square foot estate in Buckhead, sitting behind high iron gates. When I pulled my car into the circular driveway, it looked like a mausoleum. The meticulously manicured lawns were already growing wild. Stacked near the grand mahogany front doors were dozens of cardboard moving boxes. A bright neon orange foreclosure notice was taped to the glass of the front window, a screaming, undeniable testament to their ruin. I walked through the open front door. The house echoed. The expensive Persian rugs were gone. The grand piano my mother used to play was gone, likely seized by the creditors. I found them in the formal living room. It was a pathetic tableau. My father, Stanley, was sitting on a folding metal chair. The expensive leather sofas had been repossessed. He was wearing wrinkled khakis and a faded polo shirt, staring blankly at the bare walls. He looked incredibly fragile, an old man who had outlived his own myth. My mother, Patrice, was packing fine china into a box, wrapping each plate in newspaper with trembling hands. Her hair, usually sprayed into a perfect helmet of aristocratic grace, was flat and lifeless. And Deshaun was sitting on the floor, his back against the cold marble fireplace. The bespoke suits were gone, replaced by gray sweatpants. His face was hollow, covered in a week's worth of scruff. The golden boy had lost his shine. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen. I would later learn she had packed her designer bags and taken a flight to Los Angeles the moment the bank froze their joint checking accounts, filing for divorce the very next morning. When I walked into the room, my mother dropped the piece of newspaper she was holding. "Kayla," she breathed, her voice a fragile, desperate whisper. She took a step toward me, her eyes brimming with tears. "You came." "I am here, Mother," I said, my voice quiet, completely stripped of any familial warmth. My father didn't look up. He just kept staring at the wall. "We have nowhere to go, Kayla," Patrice sobbed, the tears flowing freely now. She didn't try to hide her ugliness, her desperation. She reached out, grasping the sleeve of my blazer. "The bank, they took everything. The retirement funds, the cars, the house. We have to be out by 5 p.m. We are moving into a 2-bedroom apartment in Marietta." She looked up at me, her eyes wide, begging for the daughter she had suppressed for decades to suddenly become their savior. "You own the farm," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "Julian Caldwell's office said you are liquidating the stored extract to an international buyer. You have millions, Kayla. Millions. Please, we are your parents. You can pay off the mortgage. You can buy the house back from the bank. We can start over." From the floor, Deshaun let out a broken, pathetic noise. He scrambled to his knees. He didn't stand up. He actually stayed on his knees, crawling a few inches toward me. "Kayla, please," my brother wept, the sound wet and miserable. "I'm going to be indicted. The federal prosecutors are looking at the loan documents. They say I committed wire fraud because I falsified the revenue projections to get the Sterling loan. I need a defense attorney, a good one. They want a $400,000 retainer. If I get a public defender, I'm going to federal prison, Kayla. I'm your brother. You can't let me go to prison." I looked down at the man who had kicked dirt on my grandmother's floor, the man who had stood on a stage and allowed his wife to steal my life's work, the man who had happily signed my severance package, intending to throw me out into the street so he could wear a crown he didn't earn. I looked at my mother, who had stolen her husband's life savings to fund this beautiful, toxic illusion, and who had told me to swallow my pride and smile for the cameras. I felt the last lingering thread of my childhood, the desperate, pathetic hope that they would one day love me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. Snap. It didn't hurt. It felt like breathing pure oxygen for the first time. I gently, but firmly, pried my mother's fingers off the sleeve of my blazer. "Mother," I said, my voice echoing in the empty, hollow room. It was not angry. It was the absolute, terrifying calm of a judge delivering a final verdict. Family is a beautiful concept. It is meant to be a sanctuary. But in this house, family was never a sanctuary. It was a weapon. My mother flinched, stepping back, her hands covering her mouth. You used that word to keep me quiet, I continued, looking from her to the broken man on the floor. You used it to force me to do the heavy lifting while Deshawn took the applause. You used it to demand my loyalty while you meticulously planned my execution. We made a mistake, Deshawn cried out, burying his face in his hands. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. You aren't sorry you stole from me, Deshawn, I said coldly. You are sorry that the thing you stole was a bomb and it blew up in your hands. I turned my gaze to my father, who was still staring at the wall, too ashamed, too broken to even look his daughter in the eye. I will not pay your mortgage, Mother, I said, the finality of my words settling over the room like dust. I will not buy back a house that I was never truly welcome in, and I will not pay a single cent to a defense attorney to protect a man from the consequences of his own monumental arrogance. Kayla, please, my mother wailed, dropping to her knees beside her golden son, wrapping her arms around him as they both wept on the bare floorboards. We are family. You can't do this. You can't just leave us to bleed. I looked down at them one last time. The invisible, silent ghost had finally materialized, and she was made of stone. Family is not a reason to bleed each other dry, Mother, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. I paid my dues to this family. I paid them with 15 years of my youth. My tab is closed. I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked out of the formal living room. I walked down the grand hallway, the sound of my heels striking the hardwood floor masking the sound of their weeping. I walked out the front doors, past the bright orange foreclosure notice, and got into my car. I put the car in drive, and I never looked back in the rearview mirror. 1 year later, the laboratory was a masterpiece of glass, brushed steel, and brilliant natural light. It sat on the second floor of a newly renovated, eco-friendly commercial building in the heart of downtown Austin, Texas. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the Texas sun poured in, illuminating rows of pristine extraction beakers and digital scales. The air didn't smell like tension and sterile corporate fear. It smelled like rich, dark earth, rosemary, and the unmistakable peppery floral scent of the Carolina silver leaf calendula. I stood at the stainless steel counter wearing a crisp white lab coat. I was 39 years old. The dark circles under my eyes, which had been a permanent fixture of my face for 15 years, were gone. I held up a small amber glass dropper bottle to the sunlight, inspecting the viscosity of the golden oil inside. It was perfect. The emulsion was flawless. I set the bottle down next to a sleek, minimalist label. The logo was elegant, simple, and deeply profound. Evelyn's Roots. We had launched the brand exactly 4 months ago. I hadn't used a single influencer. I hadn't thrown a lavish gala. I had simply released the product online, utilizing the massive stockpile of pure extract Thomas had harvested at Oak Haven, formulated with the exact, uncompromising scientific rigor my grandmother had taught me. The women who had been burned by Lewis Crown Botanicals, the women who had trusted our family's legacy for decades, had found us. The reviews were not driven by marketing algorithms. They were driven by results. The healing was real. The product was honest. The company was profitable, carrying zero debt, and owned exactly 100% by me. In the corner of the lab, a flat-screen television was mounted on the wall, playing a 24-hour news network on low volume. I picked up my notebook to log the batch temperature, glancing briefly at the screen. The chyron at the bottom read, Former beauty CEO found guilty of federal wire fraud. The footage showed the steps of the federal courthouse in Atlanta. A man in an ill-fitting, cheap suit was walking down the stone steps, surrounded by federal marshals, trying to shield his face from the aggressive flashes of the press cameras. He looked old, exhausted, and utterly defeated. It was Deshawn. He was facing 36 months in a minimum security federal penitentiary. The camera panned to show an elderly couple standing near the bottom of the steps, holding onto each other, looking lost in the chaotic crowd. Stanley and Patrice. They looked like ghosts haunting a world they no longer understood. I watched the screen for exactly 5 seconds. I felt a fleeting, microscopic pang of sorrow, not for the people they were, but for the family we could have been, if they had only known how to value the roots instead of obsessing over the flower. Then I picked up my remote control and turned the television off. The screen went black. I turned back to my laboratory. I picked up my pen, wrote down the formula yield in my grandmother's old leather journal, and smiled. True power is never loud. It doesn't demand the spotlight, and it doesn't need applause. True power is the quiet, unbreakable certainty of knowing exactly what you are worth and having the courage to let the rest of the world burn if they try to tell you otherwise. The empire of paper had turned to ash, but the roots had survived, and from them, the real queen had finally grown her own crown. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If Kayla's journey resonated with you, or if you've ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to protect your own worth, please let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button, and please subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your power. See you in the next video.